They say airplanes run on rules and checklists. But on one foggy night, a single seat became a security problem. A woman sat quietly in the front cabin. No disruption, no mistake. Yet within minutes, someone decided she didn't belong and turned procedure into a weapon. The delay stretched on longer than anyone expected. Outside the terminal windows, the fog sat low and unmoving, swallowing runway lights until they looked like faint smudges of color. Inside the aircraft, the cabin lights stayed dimmed, frozen in that uncomfortable in-between state where no one knew whether to settle in or stay alert. This was the kind of delay that tightened shoulders without anyone realizing it. Up front, in the premium forward cabin, Naomi Carter took her seat by the bulkhead window, seat P1. She placed her bag carefully beneath the seat, smoothed the sleeve of her coat, and sat back. She didn't rush. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She didn't announce herself. To most people nearby, she was just another passenger trying to get through the night. The cabin filled slowly. A few business travelers checked their watches. Someone sighed loudly. Somewhere behind the curtain, a phone vibrated and was silenced too late. Naomi kept her eyes forward. She had learned, over years of travel, that attention often arrived before trouble, and that trouble usually started quietly. Across the aisle, a man leaned slightly into the aisle to look again. Not long, just long enough. 2 seats back, a woman whispered something to her companion, then glanced forward. Near the galley, a flight attendant paused longer than necessary, pretending to adjust a compartment. Nothing was said, but something had shifted. In spaces like this, power rarely announced itself out loud. It moved through looks, through pauses, through who felt entitled to notice whom. Naomi crossed her legs and rested her hands in her lap. Calm. Still. She wasn't trying to disappear, but she wasn't offering explanations either. The plane hummed softly beneath them, systems running, doors still open. The intercom crackled once, then went silent again. Another update that never came. Time passed differently inside the cabin. Every minute felt longer than it was. Near the front, a flight attendant approached the cockpit, lowering her voice as she spoke. A glance followed, then another. Naomi felt it before she saw it. That subtle change in the air, the kind that happens when a private thought becomes a shared concern. Somewhere nearby, someone had decided she was worth discussing. She didn't react, not outwardly. Her breathing stayed even, her posture didn't change, because reacting too early only fed the wrong narrative. Behind the closed cockpit door, Captain Andrew Holt reviewed the passenger manifest on his tablet. Names, seats, codes, everything exactly where it was supposed to be, except one. He didn't frown, he didn't scowl, he simply paused. His finger hovered for a second longer than necessary. Out in the cabin, Naomi adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, revealing a simple watch. Old, worn, easy to overlook. No designer bag on her lap, no flashy accessories, no visible signs of importance. Just a woman sitting quietly in the wrong seat, according to someone else's expectations. A few rows back, Jason Reed, the co-pilot, glanced toward the front and then away again. He noticed the attention gathering, but said nothing. Not yet. It was easier to assume it would resolve itself. It usually did. At the gate, Emily Brooks watched through the aircraft door window as ground crew moved slowly in the fog. Her headset crackled with overlapping instructions. Another delay, another night shift stretched thin. She didn't see Naomi directly, but she felt the tension travel down the chain. Something was coming. Back in the cabin, a soft beep echoed as the cockpit door opened briefly. A voice spoke low, professional, controlled. Passengers nearby pretended not to listen. Naomi looked up for the first time, not startled, not defensive, just aware. She met the flight attendant's eyes for a brief moment, long enough to recognize hesitation there, long enough to understand this wasn't personal. It was procedural, and procedures, when left unchecked, had a way of becoming something else entirely. Around them, the cabin grew quieter. Conversations trailed off, phones lowered. People sensed the shift without knowing why. This was how power worked here. Not loudly, not violently, but with consensus built from silence. Naomi stayed seated. She didn't know yet what decision had been made. She didn't know who had made it. But she knew one thing for certain. In spaces like this, sealed, delayed, cut off from the outside world, once a question was asked about you, the answer rarely stayed simple. And the night was far from over.
Back in the cockpit, Captain Andrew Holt stared at the tablet longer than he needed to. The passenger list was routine. Names, seats, clearance codes. All green, all ordinary. Except one entry kept pulling his attention back. Seat P1. He didn't know why it bothered him. He couldn't have explained it if someone asked. There was no alert, no warning, no protocol violation. Just a feeling. Holt leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. The cockpit was quiet, broken only by the low hum of systems waiting for departure. He had flown for over 20 years, thousands of hours in the air, enough to trust his instincts. That's what he told himself. He glanced once more at the screen, then toward the closed cockpit door. On the other side of that door, Naomi Carter sat perfectly still. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't checking her phone every 30 seconds like everyone else. She was calm. And to Holt, calm didn't always mean safe. He tapped the tablet with his finger. Once, twice. The same information stared back at him, unchanged. No flags, no notes, no reason. He exhaled through his nose. Instincts like his had caught real problems before. A passenger who boarded with the wrong story. Someone who didn't belong where they said they did. Someone who looked ordinary until they weren't. That history mattered to him. In systems like this, experience was currency. Holt leaned forward and adjusted his headset. "Can you double-check the forward cabin manifest?" he asked, his tone neutral. Jason Reed, seated beside him, hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. He'd already reviewed it once. Everything was clean. "Everything's verified," Reed said. "No issues." Holt nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave the screen. Verified didn't mean finished. Out in the cabin, a flight attendant paused near the bulkhead, pretending to straighten a curtain that didn't need adjusting. She glanced toward seat P1, then back toward the cockpit door. Another small signal passed along the chain. This was how it worked. No one made a declaration. No one said, "There's a problem." They simply kept looking. Holt stood and opened the cockpit door slightly. The cabin noise filtered in, murmured voices, the soft shuffle of feet, the dull impatience of people stuck between places. He scanned the front rows quickly. Naomi didn't notice him, or if she did, she didn't react. She sat with her hands folded, eyes forward, posture relaxed. No signs of stress, no visible nerves. That, somehow, made Holt more uneasy. He closed the door again. In his mind, he framed it carefully. This wasn't about judgment. This was about responsibility, about caution, about doing his job before something slipped through.
That's how small power justifies itself, not with malice, with language. Words like precaution, words like concern, words like better safe than sorry.
Holt had learned long ago that the cockpit was a place where hesitation could cost lives. Decisions had to be made quickly, confidently, and once made, they were rarely questioned. Because questioning the pilot meant questioning the system itself. Back in the cabin, Naomi felt the shift again. Not fear, not yet. Just that quiet tightening of space around her. The sense that a decision was being shaped somewhere she couldn't see. She adjusted her seatbelt, the soft click echoing louder than it should have. A few rows back, someone leaned sideways for another look. Someone else stopped mid-sentence when a flight attendant passed. No one said her name. No one needed to. In closed environments like this, authority didn't need to raise its voice. It just needed agreement. And agreement was easy when no one wanted to be the first to object. Jason Reed glanced toward the cockpit door, then back to his captain. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. This wasn't the hill to die on. Not yet. Holt wasn't angry, he wasn't shouting, he was being careful. That was harder to argue against. At the gate, Emily Brooks received a brief message on her screen. No alarm, no urgency, just a request to stand by. She sighed quietly and adjusted her headset. Another delay, another complication. She didn't know the details, she didn't need to. Experience told her that when something came from the cockpit, it usually meant paperwork, not pushback. Back inside the plane, Holt rested his hands on the console and made his decision. He didn't call it suspicion. He didn't call it bias. He called it instinct. And instinct, in his world, carried weight. He pressed a button on the panel. Not an emergency, not yet. Just a step. The intercom chimed softly. In the cabin, heads lifted. Conversations paused. That familiar hush fell over the rows, the kind that always preceded an announcement. Naomi looked up again, her expression unchanged. She didn't know what Holt was thinking. She didn't know how close the system was to turning its full attention on her. What she did know was this. When power decided it was just being careful, the person on the other end rarely got the benefit of the doubt. And once a concern was logged, once it became official, it stopped being about facts. It became about process. And processes, when left unchecked, had a way of moving forward long after common sense told them to stop. The shift from concern to accusation happened quietly. No announcement, no raised voices, just a few buttons pressed in the right order. Back in the cockpit, Captain Andrew Holt stood with his hand resting on the console, eyes fixed on a single line of text. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. "Let's escalate this," he said. "Not investigate, not clarify. Escalate." Jason Reed looked up sharply. Escalate to what, exactly? Holt didn't answer right away. He adjusted his headset instead, slow and deliberate. A small gesture. A signal. "Potential security concern," he said finally. "Unverified behavior." Reed opened his mouth, closed it again. Unverified behavior wasn't an action. It was a category. A container you could drop anyone into once you decided they made you uncomfortable. Outside the cockpit, a chime sounded softly. The cabin lights shifted, barely noticeable. A flight attendant paused mid-step, listening to instructions through her earpiece. Her posture changed, shoulders back, smile gone. She turned toward the front cabin. Naomi Carter felt it before she saw it. The air around her tightened, not physically, socially. The aisle, once casual, became intentional. The glances grew longer, less curious,
more clinical. A flight attendant stopped beside her seat, not too close, not too far. "Ma'am," she said, voice carefully neutral, "may I see your clearance badge again?" Naomi looked up, calm, composed.
She reached into her bag and handed it over. The attendant scanned it, once, then again. Nothing was wrong. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the attendant nodded slowly and stepped back, touching her earpiece. "Copy," she said quietly. That word traveled faster than any explanation ever could. Copy meant the system was awake. Up at the gate, Emily Brooks watched a new status line appear on her monitor. Yellow, not red. Not yet. She frowned. Incidents didn't usually start this way. They came with noise, with urgency, with instructions that left no room for doubt. This one arrived politely. She adjusted her glasses and typed a note. Procedure required acknowledgement. She hesitated. One question hovered on the edge of her mind. What exactly was the issue? She didn't ask it, because systems like this rewarded speed, not curiosity. Back on the plane, Holt leaned into the intercom. "Cabin crew," he said, "hold boarding. Security protocol level 1. Level 1 sounded mild, preventative, sensible. But level 1 was how level 2 began. In the front cabin, Naomi noticed passengers around her stiffen. Someone across the aisle stopped scrolling on their phone. A man 2 rows back leaned slightly into the aisle, pretending to stretch. Eyes everywhere, answers nowhere. A second attendant arrived, then a third. No one spoke directly to Naomi. They spoke around her. "Can you confirm? Stand by. Let's keep this contained." Contained meant her. Jason Reed shifted in his seat. "Captain," he said quietly, "we still don't have—" Holt raised a hand. Reed fell silent. That was another rule of closed systems. Once authority decided something was a threat, asking for proof looked like resistance. And resistance had consequences. At the gate, Emily Brooks felt her phone vibrate. A short message. "Prepare ground security, forward cabin." She stared at the screen. Forward cabin incidents were rare. They drew attention, paperwork, questions. She imagined the scene forming in slow motion. The looks, the whispers, the way a single passenger could suddenly become the reason everyone was late. She swallowed. "Okay," she said to no one in particular. Back on the plane, the lead attendant approached Naomi again. This time, she didn't smile. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step out of your seat for a moment." Naomi looked around. "Is there a problem?" The attendant hesitated, just long enough to confirm that there was no clear answer. "It's just a precaution," she said. That word again. Naomi stood. The cabin went silent. Not the casual quiet of people resting, the sharp, collective silence of a room that knows something is happening and doesn't want to be involved. She stepped into the aisle. 2 figures appeared from the rear of the plane. Airport security, dark uniforms, calm faces. Too calm. Jason Reed watched the monitor as the status shifted from yellow to orange. "Captain," he said, his voice tight. "This is getting out of hand." Holt didn't look at him. "We're past that," he said. "Now we document." Documenting meant the accusation had already landed. Security approached Naomi, hands visible, movements rehearsed. "Man," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." "For what reason?" she asked. "Security review." That phrase was heavier than it sounded. It carried assumptions, trajectories, outcomes.
Passengers watched openly now. No one pretended not to stare. Phones stayed down. This wasn't entertainment yet. It was too close, too real. Naomi glanced once toward the cockpit door. It stayed shut. At the gate, Emily Brooks stood as security notifications began stacking on her screen. Each one confirmed the last. She felt a twist in her stomach. Everything was moving too smoothly. No one was shouting. No one was breaking rules.
And yet somehow, a woman who had done nothing wrong was being processed like a problem the system couldn't wait to remove. Back on the plane, the security officer nodded to the lead attendant. "Proceed," he said. And just like that, suspicion hardened into accusation. No debate, no appeal, only momentum. The cabin remained silent as Naomi was guided forward, past the bulkhead, toward a future no one had bothered to explain. And the most unsettling part wasn't the accusation itself. It was how easily everyone let it happen. They stopped her just past the bulkhead, not loudly, not violently, just close enough that everyone could see. The security officer stepped in front of Naomi Carter and raised a hand, palm outward. The universal signal, stop. She halted. The cabin froze with her. A second officer moved behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence without turning around. His voice was low, professional, practiced.
"Ma'am, please place your hands behind your back." A murmur rippled through the cabin and died instantly. No one spoke after that. No one wanted to be heard. Naomi didn't argue. She didn't resist. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate, and brought her wrists together. The plastic restraint slid tight with a sharp, unforgiving sound. Click. That sound landed harder than any accusation. A woman in the first row looked away. A man across the aisle swallowed and stared at the floor. Someone further back shifted in their seat, then went still. No phones came out. This wasn't spectacle yet. This was shame. The officer checked the restraint, tugged once, then nodded to his partner. "Let's move." Naomi took her first step forward. The aisle felt narrower now, the ceiling lower, the air thicker. She walked past her seat without looking at it. Seat P1 stayed empty. Behind the cockpit door, Captain Andrew Holt listened to the cabin feed in silence. He didn't flinch at the sound of the zip tie. He didn't look away from his instruments. This was procedure now. Procedure didn't require emotion. Jason Reed stood beside him, hands clenched at his sides. His jaw tightened as the voices came through the intercom. Calm voices, controlled voices. Too controlled. "She complied," someone said. Reed closed his eyes for half a second. At the gate, Emily Brooks watched the camera feed flicker on her screen. Grainy, angled too high. Enough to see movement, not faces. Enough to understand. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. There were steps she could take, calls she could make. She did none of them. The system was already moving. Interrupting it now would raise questions she wasn't ready to answer. Back in the cabin, Naomi walked. Each step carried her past rows of strangers who had watched her board, watched her sit, watched her exist quietly in a space she was now being removed from. No one apologized. No one explained. The security officer spoke again, louder this time for the benefit of the room. "For everyone's awareness, we're conducting a routine security review." Routine. That word settled over the cabin like a blanket. Routine meant acceptable. Routine meant justified. Routine meant no one needed to intervene. They reached the aircraft door. Cold air rushed in as it opened.
carrying the smell of jet fuel and wet concrete. Naomi paused, not because she was afraid, because once she stepped off, the story would belong to the system entirely. She stepped anyway. Flash. A camera went off somewhere in the terminal. Just one. Then nothing. Security guided her down the jet bridge, their hands firm, but not rough, professional, detached. The plane behind her stayed silent. Inside, a flight attendant reached for the intercom, then stopped herself. There was nothing to say.
What would the announcement even be?
Sorry for the delay caused by a woman who didn't do anything wrong. Back on the plane, passengers exhaled in unison as the door closed again. The tension shifted, but it didn't disappear. Someone whispered, "What did she do?" No one answered. In the cockpit, Holt finally moved. He marked the incident in the log. Time, seat, category, security concern. He didn't write her name. Names made things personal. Out on the tarmac, Naomi stood beneath harsh fluorescent lights as the officers checked their devices. One of them avoided her eyes. The other didn't bother. "Wait here," he said. She waited. Minutes passed, then more. No one told her what would happen next. And this is where the story could have ended. No reveal, no twist, no sudden reversal. Just paperwork, a delayed flight, a quiet escort out of the terminal, a vague apology, if any. Captain Holt would fly another route. The system would reset. The cabin would forget.
Because in most versions of this story, nothing else happens. No one powerful steps in. No hidden authority surfaces. No accountability arrives on cue. The woman walks away with the weight of the moment pressed into her spine, and the system keeps moving. That is the version thousands of people live every day. No cameras, no witnesses willing to speak, no one asking whether the process itself was wrong. Back on the plane, the seatbelt sign blinked on. The engines hummed. Passengers settled back into their seats, already convincing themselves that whatever happened must have been necessary. It was easier that way. And as the plane prepared for departure, one thing became painfully clear. The most dangerous part wasn't the restraint around her wrists. It was how normal the silence felt once she was gone. The jet bridge door closed behind her with a hollow thud. Inside the plane, the sound barely registered. Outside, it echoed. Naomi Carter stood still as the officers stepped a few feet away, speaking into their radios in low, clipped phrases. Codes, numbers, nothing that sounded like a plan. She waited. No one told her how long it would take. No one told her what came next. The terminal lights hummed overhead, too bright, too steady. A janitor pushed a cart past the end of the corridor and didn't look up. Somewhere far away, a departure chime rang, cheerful and wrong. Time slowed down in a way it only does when no one is accountable for it. Back on the plane, the cabin door was sealed again. The aisle looked normal now. Too normal. Flight attendants moved through the rows with practiced calm, straightening seatbelts, adjusting overhead bins. One of them paused by seat P1. She hesitated, then removed the folded blanket and placed it neatly on the empty seat, as if tidying up could erase what had just happened. No one asked where the woman went. No one asked why. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and reassuring. A delay, weather-related, standard language. Passengers nodded to themselves. Weather made sense. Weather was nobody's fault. Jason Reed sat in the cockpit, staring at the glowing instruments. The numbers made sense. The procedures lined up. Everything was technically correct. That was the problem. He reached for the log again, then stopped. His hand hovered in midair. He put it back down.
On the ground, Emily Brooks refreshed her screen for the third time. The incident marker was still there, yellow, pending. She exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair. Pending meant unresolved. Unresolved meant no one had to decide yet. And as long as no one decided, the system could breathe. Naomi shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The zip tie had been removed, but the sensation lingered, a phantom pressure around her wrists. A security supervisor finally approached, different uniform, slightly older.
Eyes tired. "Ma'am, we're reviewing the situation," he said. Reviewing was another soft word, like routine, like procedure. She nodded once. He checked his tablet, frowned, then looked up again. "We'll need a few minutes." A few minutes stretched easily into more. This was the space where stories usually ended. No courtroom, no reckoning, just waiting rooms and quiet exits. In most cases, the passenger would be escorted out of the terminal through a side door. There would be paperwork, a number to call, a form to file if they felt inclined. Most people didn't. They just wanted to go home. Back on the plane, the seatbelt sign remained on. Engines idled. Passengers scrolled through their phones, already half forgetting the woman who had been there. Someone joked about the delay. Someone else laughed. Life has a way of smoothing over discomfort when it doesn't belong to you. The flight attendant passed seat P1 again. This time, she didn't look at it. In the cockpit, Captain Holt adjusted his headset and glanced at the clock. The delay was still within acceptable limits. He felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. The situation was contained. Contained meant safe. No alarms were sounding. No supervisors were calling him directly. No red lights flashed. To him, that silence felt like confirmation. Out on the tarmac, a service vehicle rolled past Naomi, headlights briefly washing over her face. She blinked, but didn't move. She thought of how easily the moment had turned, how one word had led to another, how quickly authority had filled the space where conversation might have existed. She didn't know if anyone was speaking for her now. She didn't know if anyone would. Minutes later, a different notification appeared on Emily Brooks's screen. Not louder, not urgent, just different. She leaned forward. The label read, "Incident flag. Auto review initiated." She frowned. This wasn't manual. This wasn't someone stepping in. This was the system noticing itself. Back on the plane, the cockpit received a soft chime, a message alert. Captain Holt glanced at it without concern. Routine updates came through all the time. He didn't open it yet. Jason Reed saw it too. He straightened in his seat. On the ground, the security supervisor checked his tablet again. His brow creased deeper this time. He looked up at Naomi, then back down at the screen. "Just a moment," he said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. She waited. The terminal didn't change. The lights didn't dim. No one gathered around. But something had begun to move, not loudly, not dramatically, the way systems always do. Inside the cabin, passengers felt it before they understood it. A subtle delay, a pause without explanation, the kind that makes people look up from their phones. The intercom stayed silent. No updates, no reassurance. Silence pressed in again, heavier this time. Not the silence of compliance, the silence of anticipation. Captain Holt finally opened the message. His eyes scanned the first line, then the second. He didn't react, not outwardly, but his hand tightened on the armrest. For the first time that night, the quiet didn't feel like agreement. It felt like something waiting. And that was when the balance began to shift.
The message didn't arrive with a siren. It didn't flash red. It didn't demand attention. It appeared the way most consequential things do, quietly. On Captain Holt's console, a single line updated itself. New header, new timestamp. Language so neutral, it almost felt harmless. Automated review initiated. He read it once, then again. This wasn't a phone call from headquarters. This wasn't an executive stepping in. This wasn't Naomi Carter saying a word. This was the system doing what it had been programmed to do when certain lines were crossed. Holt leaned back in his seat and exhaled through his nose.
He'd seen audits before. They were procedural, slow, manageable. He told himself this would be the same. Beside him, Jason Reed noticed the change in Holt's posture. Not panic, something suppler. Tension. "What is it?" Reed asked. Holt didn't answer right away. He scrolled. The review wasn't asking whether the passenger was dangerous. It was asking why the escalation happened. On the ground, Emily Brooks's screen refreshed again. The yellow status indicator had shifted. Orange. She straightened in her chair. Orange meant the system had detected an anomaly worth tracing backward. Not punishment. Pattern recognition. She pulled up the incident tree. One decision branched into another. Each click revealed a timestamp, a justification, a checkbox marked with quiet confidence. Security concern, captain discretion, no physical threat observed. Her jaw tightened. Back on the plane, the cabin felt different now, not louder, not calmer, uncertain. Passengers sensed it in the delay that no longer had a weather update attached, in the way flight attendants stopped offering explanations and started checking their devices instead. The intercom stayed silent. Silence, this time, didn't reassure anyone. Captain Holt clicked deeper into the report. The audit wasn't reviewing Naomi Carter. It was reviewing him. His authorization, his discretion, his decision to bypass intermediate steps. That was the first crack. Because the captain's authority on an aircraft is real. It's necessary. In emergencies, someone has to make the call. But that authority has edges. It begins where risk is verifiable, and it ends where subjectivity takes over. The system didn't accuse Holt of malice. It did something worse. It questioned his judgment. On the tarmac, the security supervisor received an update on his tablet. His expression changed. Not fear, awareness. He walked back toward Naomi, slower this time. "Ma'am," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we're escalating the review." She met his eyes, calm, present. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. Inside the cockpit, Holt felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not guilt. Exposure. Every decision he'd made was now being replayed without his voice attached to it. The system wasn't listening to his tone. It wasn't impressed by his experience. It didn't care how certain he felt. It only cared whether the escalation matched the threat. And it didn't. Jason Reed watched Holt's hands tighten on the controls. The confidence that had filled the cockpit earlier had thinned. "Is there a problem?" Reed asked again. Holt finally looked at him, just for a second. "No," he said, but his screen kept scrolling. Back in the terminal, Emily Brooks picked up the phone. She didn't dial anyone. She just held it, considering. This wasn't about blame yet. This was about containment. The system was now protecting itself. It flagged how quickly authority had concentrated in one person, how easily checks had been skipped, how no one had pushed back. It wasn't asking who was right. It was asking who had the power to decide
and whether they should have. On the plane, a chime sounded again, another update. This time, Holt opened it immediately. The review had triggered a temporary hold, not on the flight, on him. He stared at the words, unreadable. Temporary oversight applied pending review. This wasn't suspension, but it was close enough to feel like a warning. Passengers shifted in their seats as the engines powered down again. A murmur spread, low and uneasy. Something was wrong. Something wasn't moving forward. And systems only stop when something inside them resists. On the ground, Naomi was escorted to a quieter area, not out of the terminal, inward. She noticed the difference immediately. The pace, the tone, the way questions were framed now, not accusatory, clarifying.
She answered when asked, briefly, precisely. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because this was no longer about her. In the cockpit, Holt removed his headset and set it down carefully. The gesture was small, controlled, but it marked a shift. For the first time that night, he wasn't directing events. He was inside them. The system he trusted to validate his instincts was now asking him to justify them. And justification is where certainty goes to die. Back in the cabin, the silence stretched. Passengers waited, not for an explanation, for resolution. They didn't know what had changed, only that it had. And somewhere between the cockpit and the terminal, between a flagged report and a quiet review, the story took its turn. Not because someone demanded justice, but because a system, once pushed too far, had begun to look at itself and didn't like what it saw. The decision didn't come with an argument, no raised voices, no slammed doors.
It arrived as a notification. Captain Holt was still in the cockpit when his tablet vibrated once against the console. Not urgent, not loud, just enough to be noticed. He picked it up, read, then read it again. Temporary suspension of flight authority, effective immediately. He didn't react, not at first. He stared at the screen as if waiting for it to change, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more familiar. They didn't. Jason Reed noticed the silence beside him stretch longer than usual. "Holt?" he said quietly. The captain didn't answer. He set the tablet down with care, aligned it perfectly with the edge of the console. A habit, muscle memory. Then he reached up and removed his headset. That was when it became real. Outside the cockpit, the cabin remained still. Passengers sensed movement without understanding it. A delay layered on top of another delay. Flight attendants received a message on their devices. Short, neutral, no details. They stopped what they were doing. One of them glanced toward the cockpit door, then looked away. On the ground, Emily Brooks closed her laptop. She didn't smile. She didn't relax. This wasn't a victory. This was containment. Naomi Carter sat in a quiet office near the terminal's edge. A cup of water rested untouched on the table in front of her. No one had asked her to make a statement yet. No one needed to. The system had already moved past her. Back in the cockpit, Holt stood up slowly. The familiar space felt different now, smaller, like it no longer belonged to him. A supervisor entered, not hurried, not apologetic. "Captain Holt," he said, voice level, "I'm going to need you to step out." Holt nodded once. He didn't protest. He gathered his jacket, smoothing the fabric as he did. Another habit, a way to keep control when control was slipping. As he walked down the aisle, the cabin went quiet. Not the quiet of fear, the quiet of recognition. Passengers looked up. Some met his eyes. Most didn't. He kept his gaze forward.
There were no boos, no cheers, just the sound of his shoes against the carpet. At the door he paused. For a moment it looked like he might turn around, say something, explain. He didn't. He stepped off the plane. Inside, the door closed behind him with a soft click. That sound landed harder than the zip tie had earlier. Jason Reed remained in the cockpit alone. He sat down slowly, staring at the controls he'd trained years to touch. He hadn't said anything when he could have. Now, there was nothing left to say. On the ground, Holt stood beneath the same harsh lights Naomi had stood under earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone watching the feeds. A badge was unclipped from his uniform, placed in a tray, not ripped away, just removed. This wasn't humiliation. It was erasure. The authority he'd carried so confidently only hours ago no longer followed him. He waited as instructions were given.
Peterwork explained, next steps outlined. All of it reasonable, all of it calm. That was the cruelty of it. There was no villain to fight, no enemy to curse, only process. Back in the cabin, a new captain's voice came over the intercom. Different tone, same script. Passengers listened, then settled back into their seats. The flight would continue. It always did. Naomi was escorted back through the terminal, not as a suspect now, but as a participant in a review. The questions she received were careful, measured, focused on actions, not impressions. She answered them the same way she'd answered everything that night, simply. Captain Holt watched from a distance as the plane finally pushed back from the gate. The engines roared, the lights shifted. He didn't feel anger. He felt something colder, confusion. He had followed procedure. He had trusted his instincts. He had believed that certainty was enough. Now certainty had no place to stand.
As the plane disappeared into the fog, Holt remained where he was, holding a jacket that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. No one told him he was wrong. They just told him he was done. And that was the quietest collapse of all. The frightening part of this story isn't what Captain Holt did. It's how certain he was while doing it. He didn't wake up that morning planning to ruin someone's life. He didn't see himself as cruel. He didn't think of himself as reckless. He thought he was responsible. That belief followed him through every step, through every decision, through every checkbox marked and every call made. On the surface, nothing he did looked dramatic. No shouting, no threats, just confidence. And confidence is persuasive. When someone speaks with certainty, people around them tend to step back. They assume the thinking has already been done, the risk already calculated. Jason Reed felt it in the cockpit. Emily Brooks felt it at the gate.
The cabin crew felt it when they chose silence over intervention.
No one thought, this is wrong. They thought, he must know something we don't. That's how power works when it's wrapped in professionalism. Holt didn't see a woman. He saw a variable, a potential disruption, a risk that needed to be neutralized. He called it instinct. He called it experience. He called it safety. Those words made the action feel clean, necessary. And that's what makes people like him dangerous. Not hatred, not rage. Certainty. Back on the plane, passengers replayed the moment in their minds. They didn't remember her face as clearly as they remembered the restraint, the process, the authority. That's how systems train us. We remember the rule, not the person. Naomi didn't shout. She didn't plead. She didn't demand respect. She complied. And in doing so, she exposed something uncomfortable. that the system didn't need resistance to become violent. It only needed agreement.
The most harmful decisions in closed systems aren't made by villains. They're made by people who believe they are protecting order. They believe the rules are on their side. They believe doubt is weakness. They believe hesitation costs lives. So they move quickly, decisively, and anyone who questions them becomes the problem. Captain Holt never thought, "I am abusing my power." He thought, "I can't afford to be wrong." That fear, masquerading as duty, is everywhere. In hospitals, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in offices where decisions are made behind closed doors. People don't ask, "Is this fair?" They ask, "What if I'm right?" And when that question goes unchallenged, harm becomes policy. The system didn't collapse because Holt was evil. It collapsed because he never questioned himself, and neither did anyone else until it was too late. That's the quiet truth beneath stories like this. The greatest damage isn't done by people who hate you. It's done by people who feel entitled to judge you. People who mistake familiarity with authority for moral clarity. People who believe their role absolves them of reflection. When certainty replaces curiosity, empathy disappears. No one asks for context. No one asks for explanation. No one asks if there might be another interpretation. They just act. And when everyone acts without questioning, responsibility dissolves into procedure. Holt stood alone at the end of this story, not because the system punished him, but because the system no longer needed him. It corrected itself, coldly, impersonally. And that correction wasn't about revenge. It was about limits. The lesson isn't that people should be nicer. It's that power needs friction. Power needs interruption. Power needs voices willing to say, "Slow down." Because the moment someone feels completely sure they are right, they stop seeing the person in front of them. They see a problem. And problems don't deserve dignity. That's the part worth sitting with. Not the punishment, not the downfall, but the terrifying ease with which harm can happen when someone believes their certainty is enough. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's not an accident. It's asking a question that doesn't have an easy answer. How many times have we trusted authority without asking why? And how often have we stayed quiet because someone else sounded so sure? That's the real danger. Not evil, but unchallenged confidence operating in silence. Justice didn't arrive that night to satisfy anyone's anger. It didn't raise its voice. It didn't demand applause. It showed up quietly in the form of limits. Captain Holt wasn't removed to make the story feel good. He wasn't taken down so the audience could feel revenge. He was removed because the system finally drew a line. And that distinction matters. Revenge wants pain to mirror pain. Justice wants harm to stop. What happened on that flight wasn't about punishing a man for being wrong. It was about preventing the same certainty from being given power again. That's why no one celebrated. The plane still flew. The airport still functioned. The world didn't pause. Justice, when it works, is boring like that. It doesn't erase the damage. It doesn't heal the humiliation. It doesn't give Naomi back the moment she lost. What it does is quieter. It says, "This cannot continue." Naomi didn't ask for Holt's suspension. She didn't demand an apology. She didn't stand in front of cameras explaining who she really was. She let the system respond to itself. And that may be the most uncomfortable part of this story, because it means justice didn't come from power being revealed. It came from power being constrained.
The audit wasn't personal. The decision wasn't emotional. It was structural. A recognition that authority without friction is dangerous.
That instinct without accountability becomes harm. And that's the lesson worth carrying beyond this story. Not every injustice will get a twist. Not every victim will be vindicated. Not every system will correct itself in time. But the goal of justice has never been to balance pain with pain. It's to redraw the boundaries so fewer people get hurt next time. That's why this story lingers, not because someone fell, but because something stopped. If you felt relief at the ending, ask yourself why. Was it because Holt lost everything? Or because you sensed for a brief moment that the system didn't get to look away? Justice isn't about destroying people. It's about taking power out of hands that have proven they can't hold it responsibly. And that kind of justice doesn't shout. It works in silence, in audits, in decisions that don't ask for permission. So here's the question this story leaves us with. Where in your own life have you seen authority go unquestioned because it sounded confident? Where have systems protected behavior instead of people? And where did silence do more damage than malice ever could? If you've lived a moment like that, at work, at school, in a hospital, in an airport, you're not alone. Share it, not to shame, not to attack, but to remind each other that certainty is not the same as truth, and procedure is not the same as justice. If this story made you pause, if it made you uncomfortable in the right way, let us know in the comments. And if you believe stories like this matter, not because they entertain, but because they warn, then you know what to do. Stay curious, stay skeptical of certainty, and don't let silence do the work of harm.